Welcome to Theology Thursday. I'm Pastor Kara.
And I'm Pastor Trudy.
And we're so glad that you could join us. We're going to read about the parable of the sower of the seeds. So yay for that.
Yes.
I think
that comes from Matthew chapter 13. I think I'm supposed to be reading. Sorry.
It's all good. It's all good.
The reading's in two chunks. I'm reading verses 1 through 9 of 13, and then we skip a huge section in the lectionary, and then we pick up at 18 and go to verse 23, where Jesus explains the parable. So we have the parable, which is what I'm reading, and then we have the explanation of the parable, which Pastor Carol will read. And just so you know, there's like 8 verses in the middle that are skipped, and we'll talk about that later. But for now, hear the gospel.
Amen.
That day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there, while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he said to them, and he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path. The birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depths of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell in good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen."
And starting with verse 18 and going to 23. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. That is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while. And when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Amen.
Yes. So, Kara, what caught your attention or imagination?
Well, Trudy, I just so adore that question. I think we talked a little bit about before we jumped into this, what it looks like to explain a parable, right? And the fact is that parables are stories or things for us to help us understand the way that God works. And if we aren't able to hear it, that means our heart is closed, right? What does it mean to have good soil? I even think about the fact that, like, this one is pretty explicitly explained. This seed is this type of person, and this seed is this type of person. And I know that for myself, one of the ones that I typically fall into is the one with the thorns, right? That the cares of the world end up suffocating what God's calling me to do. And this just comes out in a lot of different ways, because God does ask us to do things that are pretty simple on the surface, but actually require us to die to our own wants and die to our own selfish beings and dying to want to be in a position. And that's not something our American culture understands very well. I can't speak to other cultures because I don't live in them, but specifically to American culture, that tells us falsehoods like you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or falsehoods like if you work hard enough you will get ahead, they're not true.
Right.
And in a system that's really broken, and those of us who are benefiting from that broken system don't want to lose our own benefit. So that's what it makes me think of, is how sometimes what God is calling us to, I mean, it's the same thing the Pharisees didn't want to lose, right? Why did the Pharisees have him put to death? Because they did not want to lose their position of power.
Right.
They didn't want to lose their influence. They didn't want to lose their ability to control. And we do the exact same thing. How about you,
Right.
Judy? What catches your imagination?
Well, we were kind of talking about this in Bible study. We just for St. John's people, we're having Bible study on Wednesdays at 9:30 on my front porch, because it's covered and not in direct sunlight like our lawn right now. And so we were having Bible study today, and we were talking about almost exactly what you had said. But we in Lutheran theology, we call that our baptisms, right?
Right.
In our baptisms, we are called to daily die to the world and rise again with Christ, right? And how, we aren't always good soil. Sometimes we're good soil, and sometimes we readily accept the calling that God gives us. Other times, when we haven't had food and we get a little hangry, or, sorry, maybe I'm just talking about myself because I do get hangry. Or, we just aren't willing to listen. We aren't willing to open our ears. We aren't willing to do that. And we're not willing to hear what God is telling us. When we're doing that, we're not good soil. We might be thorny soil. We might be rocky soil. We might be paved soil. And the seeds that the word is spreading on us, or that the Holy Spirit is giving us, aren't being sown. And that we can be good soil when we're working at it. Because unfortunately, in order to be good soil, as a lot of our farmers know, you have to work at it to have good soil. You don't just magically have good soil. You have to spread the manure on it. You have to put that together and stir it up. I'm not a gardener, so I'm sorry. I don't know how good soil works. I suck at gardening. Everything I garden dies. Probably because I don't have good soil. Because I'm not taking the time to cultivate it, right? But if you cultivate it, same with your faith. If you cultivate your faith, which takes a lot of work, it's hard work, it's not easy work. We've heard about that the last 3 weeks, right? When we were back in chapter 10, in order to be a good disciple, it requires us to step outside of ourselves. And I had a professor in seminary that said that sin is essentially navel gazing. When we stare inward at our belly buttons all day long and do only things that make us happy, that's sin, right? But in our baptisms, we're called to die to sin and to rise with Christ. And we do that daily. And thankfully, God gives us plenty of reminders of our baptism daily. And so daily we have the ability to say, you know what? I'm messing up here. And when we do that, and when we realize that, that's when we become better soil.
Yeah.
And when we work on that more, then we can become good soil. But that's through the work of the Holy Spirit, and that's through our own wills of recognizing what that is, right?
Yeah.
That was really long and winded. I'm sorry. You should have been at Bible study. It was even longer and more winded at Bible study. Because our Romans text talks about it. Our Romans text talks about dying to the world and being people of the flesh versus being people of the spirit. So it tied in with that, which is why I got really long-winded at Bible study.
Right. And we're not talking about Romans, but Romans has been used in the past to deeply hurt people what it means to be. And so there is a certain amount of describing what is sin, because we all have different opinions on what sin is. But Trudy and I would tell you that sin affects all of us, and God looks at sin equally. So we all choose to sin daily, even just by saying, I want this, and taking it from someone else. I'm also not a gardener. So as you were talking about being a gardener, I was like, I kill plants. The only reason my current plants are alive is because my administrative person, Karen, waters them. So thank you, Karen, if you watch this, because otherwise all my plants would be dead. But that same goes for, I wonder where apathy would be in this soil. That's a question I have for today, is like, because I think one of the things that we struggle the most with is not even caring to hear the word in the first place, because it is an inconvenience. To those of us who have most of what we need, deciding if we're going to follow God or not tends to be a luxury. And a lot of times people choose not to, because it means that they have to think about their own actions and not the actions other people make. Often what I hear is, well, so-and-so is going to do that anyway. And what ultimately comes of that is, it doesn't matter if they are doing something anyway, or that's not an excuse for you. But we want to make it an excuse, right? We want to say, well, if somebody's going to make that decision anyway, why do I even care? Right. You care because God calls you to care, to not have a sin that eats away at you, and to say that God has called you to heal and protect people, even if you're protecting them from themselves. And I know that I, for myself, struggle to do that. And it gets really tiring to constantly care about people who don't want to care about other people.
Right.
So, and right now we're tired by a lot of things. I mean, some of us are really deeply angry about having to be stuck in our homes. Some are angry at what decisions other people are making. We're starting to get into the election cycle, so we're going to have a lot of shaming going on. I don't know what else to call it other than to look at a party and shame them, which doesn't accomplish anything for any of us.
Right.
And so when we hear this parable, I want to bring it into our world today and be like, well, there is something, if we call ourselves Christians, then we have to take into consideration what Christ tells us in the parables, and what that actually means for what we do in the world. And like you said, Trudy, that's work.
That's work.
And
it's not even like, it's harder work than we think, than it should be, because it's not, when I was growing up, a lot of what people who were Christians were doing were telling people that you're sinning, you're doing this wrong, instead of serving them, instead of doing what Christ has called us to do. Because it's a lot easier to sit there and say you're messing up, than it is to say, you know what, you're right, we all mess up. But how can I help you? Right. Because I think that, like, that's the hard part about being Christian, is recognizing that, not only do you mess up, but I mess up too. And how can I still serve you? Right.
Well, and it even goes, for me, it goes one step further. It doesn't matter if you mess up. I'm still called to love you through it. Like that.
Yeah.
It has no bearing on my action if you do or do not mess up. Or you do or do not have something I would consider a sin. Like, none of that matters for how I'm supposed to treat you. And that that is not the way society looks at the world. We make a hierarchy based on who is in and who is out. I mean, you can look at any middle school and know who the popular kids are and who aren't. And that's where it begins, right? Is you people who make lines, and something's cool or something's not cool, or actually cool is an outdated term. I don't know what the real term is anymore. I'm just saying that's just
I
showing
don't
me,
know either.
right? But I'm kind of showing my age. Like,
Right?
this cool is not a cool word anymore. Whatever. Anyway, off of the word choice thing. The thing is like, Christ, this good soil thing, God does till it, and God knows what it takes, right? Like, that's one of the things we bring up with the incarnation, is Christ understands what it means to have good soil and what it doesn't, and what it means to work hard and to do things, to care for people who turn around and don't say thank you. I mean, you can think of the 10 people who were cured of leprosy and only one turned around, right? I mean, he knows what that looks like, to serve someone who's not going to ever recognize that you're serving them.
Right.
The other thing is the grace in this is that God doesn't call you to do it alone, and God does understand what it takes.
Yeah. Well, and even, I mean, as I look outside and look at my driveway, even though that's paved, there's still crabgrass coming up through the cracks.
Right.
You know, even though that's considered, rocky, or I don't know what that would be in here. God is still cultivating in that.
Right. Right. And it is, we could consider it rocky soil, right? Not as readily, I mean, anyway.
But I mean, if we're going back to this metaphor of the word being the seed,
right.
If the seeds can grow up through the cracks in my concrete driveway, I guess, God's word can still work even in not good soil.
Right. And
God is still cultivating that. Right?
Even the ones where it talks about the superficial soil, right? The ones who receive it with joy and then it pulls away. I think God uses that a lot of times to lift people up in ways that help cultivate deeper soil. I think that you can be all of these things at different times and be all of them at one time or another, like you can be in rocky soil trying to make good soil, and you can not be listening and something be accomplished. It's not the end all be all of explanations of how you be a person in the world. But it is an example of the ways in which we close our ears and we close our hearts. We do that because one, sometimes things get to be too much. And I want to be clear that Trudy and I are never ever talking about taking care of yourself, because you do have to be able to care for yourself in a way so that you can care for others. What we're talking about is the reality that what we just don't want to do. Not because we can't do it, not because we don't have the ability to do it, not because God's not calling us to do it, because we just don't want to do it, because it takes our time and our energy. And that's really what the parable gets at, is if that's the attitude you have, if your attitude is, I don't have time for you, God, then you're going to not have good soil. And the word's not sitting in you. And that's not a condemnation. That's just, and God still loves you, and God still gives you grace, and still says, even though you're not listening, I'm still going to keep talking to you, and I'm still going to keep working through you, because that's the promise God gives us. And that's really awesome news, because there are a lot of days I need that good news.
There's a lot of days where I'm like, yeah, you know what, God, that takes too much work and I'm not doing it. I mean, let's be honest. I do that a lot.
I mean, that's not a,
yeah. But that kind of also leads into the pieces that were skipped, those 8 verses or 7 verses or whatever it is that were skipped, where Jesus says, where Jesus' disciples ask Jesus, why do you speak in parables? Basically, like, parables are hard to understand. Why do you speak in them? And Jesus says, because they're hard to understand. Because those who need to hear it will hear it. And there are those who don't want to hear it and don't want to understand it, and they're not going to get it. And that's the reality of why Jesus speaks in parables. It's interesting that's, I mean, we skip that part because it doesn't fit tidily in with, here's the parable, now here's the explanation of the parable. So that's why our lectionary skips it. But it kind of plays into what we were just talking about, that we don't always want to hear what Jesus has to say and what Jesus is telling us. So we're the ones that aren't listening to the parable. Sometimes. And sometimes we're eager to hear that, and we're eager for that to be poured into us.
Right. I also think about the fact that parables are not object lessons. Whenever you look at a parable, it is not a simplistic way to explain something. It's trying to talk to you about who God is and how God works. And whenever we look at texts from from our Gospels and stuff, a lot of times we want to put ourselves in the middle of it instead of saying, okay, how is God working through this? And what does this mean for what God does? Because God has given us the Word, and the Word does flourish. And like Trudy said, does provide good soil in the most awkward of places, like in between concrete slabs, right? The other aspect of this is you don't get to decide what soil other people have.
Yes.
Like, you can't sit there and say to someone else, oh, you're rocky soil, or you're, shallow soil, or you're thorny soil. I can't tell any of you what matters to you or what doesn't. What I can say is that this is the parable that Christ gave us to help us explain why things don't take root.
Right.
And if you've ever tried to dig up a tree, you know that their roots go down pretty far, right? And it's a pain in the butt to try and get it out.
Even the little volunteer trees that pop up in my garden.
That's what I'm actually speaking about, because I was pulling out volunteer trees the other day, and I couldn't get them out by pulling. I had to get a shovel. I had to cut them off at the, and so there are things that will pop up, and there will be really awesome ways in which, like, soil moves, right? The other analogy I want to bring up that I heard was dirt versus soil. And someone, and I can't remember their name, said that dirt is just misplaced soil. And so when you talk about dirt, because like your kids will come in and they're dirty, right? But most of the time they've been playing and experiencing something that is awesome, right? So like my example would be the other day, my kids were playing in mud. They totally made a mud pit and they were covered in dirt. But at the same time, for an hour and a half, they played and just enjoyed cultivating and enjoying their time together, right? And so does the dirt outweigh what they got from the hour and a half of play? No, like totally worth it. But that's an aspect that we have to talk about, because a lot of times we avoid dirt. We avoid soil. We avoid getting into the nitty gritty. And I don't think this parable allows for that. Like you have to be a seed. If this grace thing means anything, if what God did on the cross and the incarnation mean anything to you, you have to be able to let that take heart in you. And be poured into you, very much like we think of baptism and dying to sin. And there's a reason we have all of these images in our traditions. And it's awesome and amazing and hard all at the same time.
Yeah. And to wrap this up, I gave a reminder to my Bible study that anytime you see water, you're reminded of your baptism. And so I encourage you that when you hear this and when you that like you're reminded of what your baptism means, that you are daily dying to sin, and that every time you see water, you get a new chance to to cultivate that soil within yourself and to cultivate that faith within yourself, because we need as many chances as we can get. So I'm going to hold up my water bottle and say, remember your baptism. Sorry, this is the closest thing of water next to me.
I don't have any water close to me, but I was going to say, when you're drinking those 8 glasses you're supposed to get a day, healthy
Yes.
a day, because you're 70% water, most likely. And it is. It's the grace that we're given. The good news is that the grace is abounding, and God has taken away the lines, and that's freeing. And Trudy and I don't talk about the work in the sense that we don't know that it's, we know that it's work, but at the same time, it's freeing work. When you have deep-seated roots, you can bend in the wind and not break. When you have deep-seated roots, you're able to weather storms that others are not able to. The hope is that when you hear and you grow and you learn and you know that God is with you and that God is going to help you through all of those situations which challenge you to either not care or to only think about yourself, God gets and is just making your roots that much deeper so that nothing can shake you. And that's not so that you judge others. That's so that you can be this shade for others and this strength for others and this place where people run and can lean on you. That's the beauty of people who get to plant things. I am sometimes very jealous of them because they get to see something grow its roots. So I hope that we have planted seeds in you today, and are thankful for you joining us.
Yes.
I'm Pastor Kara, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, see you. Thanks, guys.